Welcome to Futureworks, a podcast dedicated to the conversation around innovation within the workforce space. Here, we're going to share research and inspiration, a little bit into what we're building and learning at Aspect, and we'll have conversations with leaders. We'll look at case studies and bring our curiosity to explain what it takes to reinvent solutions as we look at the workforce industry. My name is Michelle.
And I'm Gillian, and we are your hosts. We're here to guide you through raw and honest dialogue about what's happening in the world of work, and more importantly, how it can be better. And today's guest shares a last name with me. He is my dad. I share his last name. I took it. He's a seasoned leader, an educator, and a design thinker with a remarkable career. I'm really happy that we get to share him with you all. Not only did he spend the last 2 decades of his career reshaping AIGA, which is a global design organization, he has a really compelling background from educating himself at Dartmouth, spending time with the Navy in the Vietnam War, going off to Stanford Business School, um, leading public policy within public broadcasting in Washington, D.C., which then led him to take over AIGA. He commuted, when I was a kid, commuted from Washington, D.C. to New York City Monday through Friday for at least an entire year before he moved us to Connecticut, which goes to show you how dedicated this man is to being a leader. And AIGA was a really pivotal point, not to speak for you, Rick, Dad, we'll call you Rick in the podcast. Not to speak for you, but a very, very defining point in your career where you got to take something that was kind of crumbling a little bit and turn it around. And so today we're going to connect with Rick on how design thinking found its way into leading an organization and also tap into his experiences guiding businesses and human beings through change with thoughtful and intentional leadership. Welcome.
Thank you. Looking forward to this.
I'd love to hear just a couple sentences of how you kind of introduce yourself to the audience and the listeners.
You hit on most of the high points, but there have been a couple of trends in my background. As Gillian pointed out, I went to Dartmouth and then went into naval intelligence and ran an agent network in Cambodia for a while, and then was a journalist. I was at Associated Press in South Bronx, and then Time Magazine. And that's where I began to value observing, because ultimately that becomes really important, I think, in the career path in terms of becoming not only productive, but also innovative and responsive. Then I realized that actually I wanted to be more of an actor than an observer for a brief period of time, at least. And so I went to business school in order to introduce techniques and disciplines to the public sector and did urban design and urban economics, urban policy research. I had my own consulting firm, but then I worked with public broadcasting. And I think there's a lesson there too, which was, if any of us are any good at consulting, we go from success to success. I mean, if you're any good, you do something and you look at it and the client is pleased and you walk away. But you can't build character on successes. You can only build character on failures or risks. And so I thought, instead of being a consultant, I should get inside an organization. And that's when I got into public broadcasting and handled legislative strategy and also strategic planning and technology planning. And then I became CEO of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design, and then ultimately design thinker in residence at Williams. And I think what that background shows you is that, it may be useful for me not to focus so much on design thinking techniques, although I'll hit the high points on it. This diversity in my background points to one mantra I've sort of carried around, which is people, like plants, need to be repotted regularly or we become root bound. And so instead of staying in the same profession, one might want to go farther, because one thing that it does by moving around is it keeps you fresh. And if you do the same thing over and over, your critical instincts are going to become dull. And even worse, you lose your open-mindedness, because you may have done something that you're challenged with today 6 years ago and it didn't work. And so you assume it won't work now, which is not the case. So there's a lesson there, and I think what I'd like to do is reveal a number of lessons like that.
Can being a true observer and a listener, do you believe that that is a skill that can be taught? Or is that something you're born with?
No, well, some people are born without a shutter on it. Um, but you can open that shutter with a little discipline. And I think that if you understand why it's important, then maybe it's easier. And so, I definitely think it can be taught.
The repotting kind of example, just to double click into that for a minute. Can you break it down quite literally of what an example of that for somebody would be? It's truly a different career path? Is it a different role within an organization?
It's both of those things, I think. I think ultimately being a specialist uh, is not the best course for someone to take. I think what you want are T-shaped individuals, ones who have a broad set of skills and interests and curiosity. And then the ascender there is a single area in which you have a skill set. The truth of the matter is, in most of the problems we solve, particularly when they're complex, it's the adjacencies that define whether a solution is going to be successful or not. You have to be able to look laterally in order to see what the second order consequences are. So if you're not in a single silo for most of your career, it enhances your capacity to look to the left and look to the right and find where the secondary consequences are going to occur. And that's normally where success occurs.
So I'm interested to know in your experiences, what pieces did you apply across the board? Like what did you bring with you at each location and sort of maybe track like which things did you leave behind?
The dominant attribute I bring is curiosity, right? Curiosity and a willingness to move beyond what my current knowledge base is, rather than trying to be an expert. It's trying to be someone who's agile and moves across problems um, with an open mind. And so, in every job I've had, whether it's house painting on a summer during college, or whether it was the Navy, I take things from every one of those jobs, and you don't really leave them behind. You don't leave much behind. Hopefully, you leave behind the dynamic that you've created in terms of encouraging people to be uh, thoughtful, open minded, curious, and creative. You don't really leave a lot of yourself behind. You take it with you, and it keeps building in terms of this bibliothèque of skills and experiences. When I was a young consultant, before I had realized that I should be listening instead of talking, I had a job with a sewer district in the Sacramento Valley. And they wanted to expand their dimensions so they could increase the tax base. So it was a matter of drawing a boundary for a new taxing district on the map. And so after spending several days there and coming back and announcing that I thought where the line should be drawn is along the ridge line in the mountains that surrounds the valley. The fire chief said, "Yeah, that's fine, kid, but you can't pump shit uphill." And that's always been something that I've remembered, because you've got to be careful. You've got to get yourself into the mindset of those people you're trying to address.
Yeah, actually, I have one ingrained in my head from when I was at Red Antler, which was I was saying something more so to say something than for it to be valuable. And the creative director told me to not state the obvious. And
Right,
that runs through my head. That was 10 years ago, and it runs through my head multiple times a week.
right.
Um, you got to learn, I
You
guess.
have to learn, and believe me, on one board that I one it's Corporation Public Broadcasting, where the board is appointed by the president, and they go around the board table to have discussions, and it was so clear that each board member seemed to be only interested in saying what they have on their mind rather than what the agenda is, and you realize you've got to fight some of that stuff sometimes, and as it occurred with you, Gillian, you've got to have somebody who's a mentor who straightens you out on that.
Let's get into the head of Ric Grefé right when you accepted your CEO position with AIGA. It was a shit show. And you are, CEO, getting on a train to New York City. This is, for the listeners, an organization with a chapter in every major city throughout the country. You're not just leading an office in New York of employees, you're leading a community of supporters that are waiting for the big next step. So I'd love to just have you unpack that further.
I walk into an organization that was 80 years old, and uh, had probably passed its prime in terms of being a small club of very effective designers. And I mean a very small club in New York. And it had started to expand nationally, but it was 3,000 members. When I left, it was 28,000 members. And when I got there, there were 30 chapters around the country. And when I left, there were 72. So we expanded dramatically. Now, what do you do first? The first thing you do is try to get every employee to tell you what their vision is for the organization and what they think needs to be accomplished that they have not been encouraged to accomplish. And when you find there are people who have neither of those visions, you might well start changing the staffing a bit. Ultimately, you want everyone to be working toward a certain outcome. And so that's what I did first, and then introduced some policies and procedures, which some people would say that sounds awfully bureaucratic. My instinct was let's not waste time resolving issues over and over and over again. Let's resolve them once. We write them down. Everybody goes follows that, unless you object. And then if you object, let's change it. But let's not waste time. So there were a number of things, giving it structure and armature, and then giving it vision and direction and ambition. It had been a club of very successful designers in New York. This was a rapidly growing profession, and the question is, how do you turn it from a club to the hub of a profession, club to hub? I mean, or as the old moniker would be, um, from a cathedral to the bazaar. Just get out of the you know cathedra, the chair that the bishop sits in, and step out front of the cathedral where everybody's milling around, and that's where you ought to be. And so that was part of what caused such a change. And I think that it gets at, once again, who are you really trying to serve?
Given how much fun people would have at the AIGA conferences, I think you definitely succeeded with that.
Yeah, that was
Party Central.
right.
Can you give a non-designer, like a layperson like myself, a good working definition? Like when you say design thinking, what are we talking about?
Here is a little known fact. How did that term come up? It came up because someone named David Kelly, who was the founder of IDEO, which was always seen as sort of the uh, premier design thinking consultancy. A client came to him and asked him to do something. He said, I want you to design it. And he said, no, think. And the client said, no, design. And David said, no, think. And somehow it came together, because the truth of the matter for designers is that design is 10% of it. Listening is 90% of
Mm.
it, in order to get the dimensions of the problem. So design thinking is simply focus on humans, on real people and what they need. Because once again, institutions can very easily reach the point where uh, you are putting something out. It could be a product, it could be information, but that's not necessarily what your client wants. What they want is something else. And so, how do you get people to focus on real people rather than precedent or rather than institutional benefit? Design thinking could easily be called human centered design. Observe first. I mean, talk to people, follow them around, see how they really behave, and then come up with some rapid prototypes of what you think would solve this problem and test them. And if it doesn't work, try another one. I mean, it's a classic case. Premature babies had a high mortality rate in India. And the assumption with the World Health Organization in that case was that there weren't enough incubators. The researchers went to these hospitals in India, and they were shocked because there were like 10 or 12 high level, expensive incubators there, and all of them were empty. And what they discovered was people had a hard time getting from a rural village to the hospital with a preemie. So what the designers came up with was little sleeping bags. Put the child in immediately and get him to the hospital. And instead of $20,000 for a incubator. It was $200 for this little sleeping bag, and they could be distributed easily. So that's where you look at what's really happening and don't come in with assumptions. And
Hmm.
that's where design thinking has its strongest play.
Design thinking is obviously being utilized in more leadership and management environments than it was when it was more of a product oriented response. I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks up your sleeve around what an intangible prototype can look like from a management standpoint.
I think one of the most important ways to use it is basically communication. Because, Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, when she set up the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, she hired Rhodes Scholars, Supreme Court clerks to run all the different divisions. I mean, this is brilliant, except she wanted to make sure that they were understanding that it was their output, not their input, that was critical. So she had us do a design thinking workshop where we showed them how to think about the individuals who they're trying to serve. And that's basically consumers who are being, manipulated by financial institutions. And at the end of the day, even she said, now I get it. We are not in the information business. We're in the understanding business. And so, you could see that people could be providing a lot of information, but it's irrelevant if people can't absorb it properly. So, in communication, the idea of really understanding your audiences and understanding what's important to them, what their attention span is, that becomes really critical to being effective.
It's shifting perspective and it's a tool for that. I'm curious how leaders ensure that their team is empowered to lead with curiosity or grow with curiosity. How have you done that as a leader in your experience?
We're all used to the hierarchy where there's the CEO, there's the C suite, there are, middle managers, and then there are information workers or whatever. Now, if that hierarchy exists, then an awful lot of people look up the chain of command to get both direction and confirmation. But and where does that leave the clients, the customers? Well, the customers are below the analysts, right? So everybody's looking up at the management. If you flip the hierarchy and say the function of the CEO and every manager is to look at the relationship between the lower level analysts and customers, and their whole job is to make sure that that relationship is productive, successful, strong, engaging, then the whole attitude of the place is how do we all work toward this objective of making that a rich customer experience? So that's certainly one way to deal with it. In design thinking, one of the techniques, and you've all seen it, are the stickies on the whiteboard. But there's some functions that go on in that process that are really kind of interesting because, among other things, you want to train people for divergent thinking before convergent thinking. In other words, come up with lots of ideas before you limit them. When people put stickies on the board and use a Sharpie, the reason you want to use a Sharpie is because you can't write very much on a sticky. So you have to be accurate, right? And you put them up there, and when they reach that board, every suggestion is anonymous and equal. The hierarchy's gone. Nobody knows who wrote what. And then if you have a group organize these around themes, the group takes credit for the entire group of comments. So you no longer are segregating upper level and lower level ideas. You're forcing everybody to participate. So there are things like that you can do that help people get beyond the certainty and toward something that is more collaborative, more creative, more open-minded.
I love how you talked both about like, okay, here's what, our leadership can do with design thinking. Here's what you could do kind of as a doer in your organization with design thinking. If you were going to give someone a really practical way that you could go apply design thinking to, your next project, what would be like the very next step someone could take?
There are a series of techniques, as I mentioned, and they're well documented. I mean, IDEO has published a handbook, and there are a couple others that are available. Once again, emphasizing the understanding real people, and that means not only listening, I mean, asking questions, but listening to the answers, but also follow them around and watch them, and just spend time with them because you'll discover things that are really surprising. I mean, you will discover why they don't fill out the box on the right on that ballot. You'll find out all kinds of things that um, about behavior that aren't part of your intellectual, framework in solving the problem. What are you trying to instill in the people that work with you? You're trying to instill creative confidence. Take risks and be creative. You want them to master collaboration, and you respect all ideas, and you learn to value failure because failure is the way you discover things. Now that can be taken to an extreme. I mean, Musk says, break it and then fix it, right? Iterate, 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 and discover storytelling. Storytelling uh, goes back to at least my experience that you have to be effective in communicating. Let's take an example. The the queen dies and the king dies. Those are facts. The queen dies and the king dies of a broken heart. Now that's a story. And why is that important? Because people remember it and they share it. So suddenly you've engaged your audience around things you're trying to tell them.
Hmm.
And so, you really have to discover storytelling and go on to that next step, which is engage your audience.
I'd like to position kind of what we're talking about as your approach to creative leadership. But what would you say to somebody who says, I'm not a creative, I'm not creative, I don't know how this could possibly apply to me? I just am curious what you would say to them.
And what you have to do is you have to take it away from the vocabulary of creative. So let's just talk about abundance. Let's think about how many ideas we can come up with, what could really make a difference. And if there's fear around creativity, you want to move that aside. I mean, that's the way I would approach that.
Hmm. Well, this has been fantastic. Any other kind of nuggets that you wanted to pass along to us of wisdom?
Yeah, yeah, there is one actually. There's another lesson that I took early, probably 40 years ago, that I've never forgotten. You may know the artist Christo, who used to wrap things in fabric. So, I mean, he wrapped the Arc de Triomphe, he wrapped the Rifle Valley in Colorado. He had done a 23-mile fence in Marin County of orange fabric. And when he did that, I saw him and I said, doesn't it drive you crazy working with the planning and zoning people to get permission to put a 23-mile fence across all this property? And he said, Rick, that is the art. Anyone can hang a curtain. Get to love the administrative, bureaucratic speed bumps and pride yourself on getting over them rather than feeling frustrated by it, because that's always going to be part of the challenge. So don't turn against it because it will compromise your own effectiveness.
That is such a good piece of wisdom. I'll be sharing that with my team. Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Amazing. Rick, Dad, thank you for being here. Um, Anything else from you, Michelle?
No, thank you so much. It was so fun to kind of just sit and see the two of you together. So, thank you so much for all of the incredible wisdom and just a really fun and informative conversation. I have so much I want to go think through.
Oh, good. Well, I hope it's useful and I hope it works within your place, of business. So.
We should probably send everyone in the company some post-it notes and maybe a little duct tape.
You're right. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Everyone, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you listened to today and it sparked something in you, hit subscribe and follow along as we continue to explore innovation and imagination in the workplace. Thank you again to Ric Grefé for giving us guidance and wisdom around creative leadership, opening the door to design thinking within the workplace, and just spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.